Where are you based right now? Are you in Montreal?
Oh, no, I am in Winnipeg.
Got it.
Yeah. All right. So, welcome, everyone. If you can hear me, say yes on chat. There we go. Okay. There we go. So, we are super excited to welcome Emmanuel Straschnov and his work as co-CEO and founder of Bubble. Bubble is a revolutionizing the way software is being built, making it as easy as pointing and clicking on a platform. Joining us from New York, he is here to share exactly how no-code is changing the development workflow. All right.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's great. I wish next year we'll do that in person, but it's also quite amazing to be able to do this from New York and talk to people from anywhere in the world. I prepared a slideshow to share with you guys as I'm talking about no-code. And I'm glad to talk about no-code at the software conference because recently, as the no-code space is getting more and more traction, it's seen as something that is not for engineers and is more open to other people. And for most of it, it's true, but I do think it has major implications in how software is built in general, and therefore how software engineers can be part of that process. So what I want to cover over the next 20 minutes and keep some time for questions is, first of all, a few words about who I am and what I'm doing for a job. Then I want to talk about, from my perspective, what visual programming or no-code is about. These terms have been used in academia for a very long time, but finally we start seeing them in the business world, and I think that's a very interesting development. Then I want to get to the core of the matter, which is what is that changing for engineers and how software is built. And finally, I want to put a few words into why I think this is actually a natural evolution that we're seeing right now, and put that into the perspective for the longer term computer science history over the last few decades. Starting with who I am first. So I'm personally trained in mathematics and physics in France. I went to the French school system. That said, I came to technology actually fairly late in my career, so close to when I was 30. Before that, I was mostly in business, started in consulting in China, and I even have an MBA. So in many ways, not necessarily a traditional background to start a software company, yet here I am. So after my MBA at Harvard, I met Josh through some mutual friends in 2012, and we started the company together. The story is actually that we started the company after our first coffee meeting, which I don't necessarily recommend for most people. Starting a company with someone that you just met once is a little bit like getting married after a first date. But 8 years later, we're still there, and I'll be happy to answer questions about that if people have some. And Josh and I have been running the company since then. And so talking about Bubble a little bit, because Bubble is my way to understand and to form an opinion on what no-code and visual programming is. I would even go further. It's my way to try to shape what no-code is about in the next decade. We started the company with the goal of empowering non-technical founders to start businesses. So we started pretty far from thinking about, let's change how programming works, but just, there is a problem here. There are a lot of domain experts in New York. We were in New York back then, we still today, but this is something that is true anywhere in the world, where we have a lot of domain experts that want to start companies online, and they can do it because they need to find an engineer to be their CTO. And we felt it was a shame because a lot of the things they were creating were pretty similar. At the end of the day, a marketplace for an apartment or for a car is a pretty similar software from a technical standpoint. And so we decided, let's just create a tool so that they can do that. And over time, what we noticed is, even though it's still the core of our mission, fostering entrepreneurship, it became a much bigger thing because people could start using this for any purpose, because it was very important for us to create Bubble as a general programming tool. general purpose programming tool. And so the mission became a little bit wider into, let's reinvent what programming looks like and how it works and the programming workflow. And so today, after 8 years, it took us a few years to get to the MVP level. I consider this period about maybe 5 years between 2012 and 2017. And now we have a solution that is actually very powerful. And Bubble is one of the leading companies in the newly formed no-code space, which started getting traction, I think, late 2019 and really blew up in 2020. And I think 2021, we'll see the no-code space become a household name. One thing interesting about the way we structured Bubble, we're a startup, and eventually ended raising money. But for the first 6 years, we actually self-financed everything. And the reason it's important is because it actually gave us way more control in our timeline to build a product that actually was working, because we didn't have any external pressure from investors. And in many ways, I think the first 5 or 6 years of the company very much looked like what we could have done had we been in academia trying to build the same thing, even though the only difference might be that we were a little bit more focused on the customer and the user, because the fact that we were able to do that without external funding means that we had people that were paying us to use us. But we did have much more control than usually startups have in controlling our timeline, because we didn't have external investors. So let's go into what visual programming or no code is about. I personally prefer calling this visual programming. No code has become a buzzword that I'm adopting here, but fundamentally, I think what we're really talking about is making programming visual. And so to start, before getting into this, the point that I want to make that a lot of, I think, is at the root of what Bubble is about and what no code is about in general, and sometimes it seems a little bit controversial, is that programming and coding are two very different things, and they're actually at a different level. Programming means designing an application, a site, a website, whatever. And by designing that means, figuring out what it looks like, what it does, and defining without ambiguity how it should react under specific circumstances. So to be very practical, what that means is to program something, you need to think, okay, my user has identified with some credentials, meaning he's logged in and he clicks here, what should happen? He clicks there, what should happen, right? Coding is just the medium that has been used to so far program. So if I wanted to be a little bit provocative, I would tell you that coding is literally putting your hand on the keyboard and typing things in a way that is very clear to the computer, but not necessarily clear to humans, because reading code takes a lot of training to understand what it means. And so if you start thinking that programming and coding are two different things, and that coding is merely the medium that people use to program, then why not changing that medium? And that's precisely what visual programming is about. So to be very practical, visual programming means, enabling people to do the things that I just described as this is programming, but doing that through a graphic user interface. So by pointing and clicking. And so to give an example of what that physically looks like today, practically looks like today in Bubble, is that, the design part, it's always pretty much the same thing. Visual Basic started that in the 90s, or Delphi with Boland, where you drag and drop your interface. Because at the end of the day, an application is just going to be a collection of text, buttons, images, and a couple of other controls. And the way you program it, and that's where different tools have taken different approaches, but our approach here is by defining a workflow which describes what the application does when the user does something or when something happens. So what you can see on the right here is literally when the button login is clicked, we log the user in, then we hide an element, we log this with segment for analytics, and we change the page. That's what you're seeing here is actually how we've programmed our own Bubble.io website, because we use Bubble to build our own things. And so our point is that if you provide enough control to the user, accessible through clicks, you can go extremely far in how customizable the software is. And one of the concerns that we've heard about visual programming tools for decades is that this is limited. I'm assuming a lot of engineers in the crowd might say, yes, you can go very far with that. And I think back in 2018, 2018 showed a breakthrough where now the limits have been pushed extremely far. And I'm proud of saying that Bubble is actually the tool that went the furthest here. So if you guys are curious, if you go to notrealtwitter.com, you'll see a Twitter clone that was built solely on Bubble without a single engineer. And the reason this is possible is, as I was pointing out a minute ago, because we offer a ton of granular control that is accessible when people click just through clicks, where you can generate complex expressions to identify those different circumstances, all without code, but very, very granular. One last important thing to notice about no-code platform is, since we're mostly targeting non-technical people, and I'll get in a second how it changes the life of technical people as well, that means you need to offer the hosting as well. It wouldn't be realistic to create a platform that just generates code and then tell people to use that code to run somewhere, because most of our users don't even want to deal with that. They don't know what to do, if the server crashes at 4 a.m. in the morning. And so fundamentally what that leads us to is that the entire infrastructure is abstracted. Our users don't think in terms of servers. They have an application for a business need, and behind the scene, we just make sure everything works well. One last very important thing for the topic that we're covering today is that missing features in the Bubble platform, and that's one thing that we did differently from a lot of other no-code tools, can be extended with code, which is one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily in love with the no-code denomination. And that's where things start becoming very interesting for the software development workflow, because engineers are still part of the picture. They can still extend the platform with code when it's needed. So what does that mean in practice? The old way of building things, the old development workflow, is extremely inefficient. It's inefficient because you need an engineer/coder for every step of the way. And very frequently, the coder, what you'll see is that the coder is merely transcribing the product vision of someone else. That's why there is such a thing as a technical co-founder. Someone, I don't know, a lawyer has a better idea for software that can help the law field, like the work of lawyers, is going to try to find a technical co-founder to implement that idea for him. And that's where it starts becoming inefficient, because I would argue that the CTO here is not necessarily value adding, except his ability to transcribe a product vision that is going to look like mockups and wireframes into code that can be executed. And this is especially true when you think that it's hard to give a percentage, but I would say 60 to 70% of the software that is built in the world today is actually fairly simple. At the end of the day, it's going to be a crude application with users creating entries, the application displaying, modifying entries, and being able to pull some data out. In many ways, Facebook or Airbnb are just a database where people upload things and they're displayed in some ways. And when you think about those soft pieces of applications that way, it is kind of a shame that we use coders for every step of it, because they're not actually breathtaking, particularly new. Engineers effectively are reinventing the wheel very frequently. And that is very expensive. And it's actually very problematic, because today, software is the biggest bottleneck for any organization. For the smallest startups to the largest companies and governments, things are slow because it's slow to build software. I'm pretty sure the current sanitary situation, were governments able to build things faster, might have looked very differently had they been able to use software faster to address the current issues. And so the new way to build software, which is what no-code is really about, is a world where business people build products and engineers build features. And the difference here is very important. That means you don't need an engineer anymore to build the product vision that people have in their mind, a non-technical person. So to my example of a lawyer, the lawyer who wants to build a better platform to help the legal work can do that themselves through an interface like Bubble. And engineers are only brought in when something is missing that was not pre-built in the no-code platform. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're building a new dating platform, a new dating web application or iOS application. The interface of the swipe that you have on Tinder, this is not new. Today, all dating platforms, the apps, pretty much follow the same design pattern. So you don't want to use valuable engineering time to build that. What you want to do, though, because if you want to build a new dating platform, is because you have a good idea. This is very likely going to be because you have a better way to match people. Matching people is something that is more at the algorithmic level is something that is actually not easy to express in a visual language like Bubble. That's where you need an engineer. And the Bubble platform lets you have business people build the application with the swipes and everything, which is usually going to work better because business people tend to know the user better because they talk to them every day. And at some point, the business person building the product owner, will talk to his engineering colleague and say, hey, in this workflow, I need an action to find the right fit match for that particular user. Please build this. And the engineer would build that. And the value of doing it that way is that it creates a common language for technical and non-technical people that work on a product together to agree on what should be built at a much more granular way and avoid lost in translation issues. One of the reasons why you see so many horror stories around outsourcing and people trying to get offshore companies to build software for them, it's not because those companies are not great. Some of them, I'm sure, are great. The problem is, if you just discuss on building an application, it's actually very hard to agree and be very sure you're on the same page between the product, not owner, but the person who's buying the project, who needs the product eventually, the client, and the engineer. Because the client will have a lot of things in his head in terms of, or her head, in terms of where the buttons should be on everything, that are not necessarily easy to put on paper. If you develop in the Bubble environment, for instance, or other no-code platforms, then you create a common ground where both technical and non-technical people can talk with the same language. The value of doing it that way also is that engineers only focus on what is new and then stop reinventing the wheel. And therefore, the coding time that they have, which is probably one of the most valuable resources today, given the shortage of engineers, can be used much more efficiently, especially if you create things in a way that can be shared with other people. You could argue that this is basically what has been happening with the open source movement for more than a decade now, and that's very true. The only thing, though, is that to consume open source code, you need to be a coder. And the market that is addressable there is actually fairly small. Again, for the shortage of engineers is something that is global and happening everywhere. Our experience with Bubble is that for one coder, whereas, who's been through the training either as a teenager or in college to be able to build things with code, you can probably find like 100 people who are Bubble competent and can get up to speed very quickly. So effectively, what we're recommending here is something that is just an evolution of what has been happening so far, but with a much bigger market. So the value of doing things that way is that you can get a product off the ground extremely quickly. The not whale Twitter example that I just talked about literally took 4 days. This is something that very few engineers would be able to do, not because they're bad and people using Bubble are good. It's because Bubble is a high level of abstraction, and as soon as you go high level, you lose a little bit control, but you can go much faster. Similarly, try to build Airbnb.com in assembly language. You probably can, or C++. You probably can, but it's going to take you a lot of time. Use React, and this is going to be much, much, much faster. Bubble is merely just another layer on top of that stack. The other thing, as I was just pointing out, is that probably 100 times more people can build. So if you create a process that is 100 times, that has 100 times bigger pool that can use your tool and goes faster, the productivity gain for the entire business world, which again depends very heavily on software being built in time, is the impact is gigantic. At the company level, when you start looking at a team, again, because the tools are more accessible, anyone can start pushing updates. And so engineers stop being the bottleneck that are being bugged by people all the time. Oh, we need to push a fix for this typo. These things can happen without engineers being part of the flow, which is a much more efficient way to do this. We ran a survey of not just Bubble users, but people active in the no-code space last year that we're going to make public a few weeks from now, which we call the no-code census. And when you ask people how much faster do you think using code is versus traditional development, what we hear is that it's going 6 times faster, which if you think of it is an incredible breakthrough because again, building software is the biggest bottleneck for the business world today. So as I was working on these slides yesterday, this tweet came that piqued my attention on Twitter about someone who was describing a way to pull tweets, from the Twitter API and display them differently on his on the web application. And he literally did this. He did that at the game and used his watch to see that it took 17 minutes and 43 seconds. This is actually, and this is already hosted. You could use a URL. You could share that with people. The app itself does not. It's not very useful. Like Twitter already exists, and you don't need to display those tweets like this. But ask yourself, can I, as an engineer, do that fast? Can I deploy something that is accessible through a URL to prod in 17 minutes and 43 seconds? My guess is that no, you can't. And that's where the programming workflow is being deeply impacted by these new technologies. And so my point here is, even though I understand, I'm mostly talking to software engineers who, because it's a high level of abstraction, will probably see what I'm talking about as, okay, maybe that's cool, but I like having more control. It's actually a fantastic opportunity for engineers to spend their time in a more valuable way and only focus on building new things. The last few points I want to make here before taking questions is why I see this as a very natural evolution. And I'm saying this because a lot of people think, because of the jump from like a coding text-based way to program, aka coding, to a visual platform like Bubble, people see that as a very big jump. But I actually think this is not that big of a revolution compared to what has happened over the last 40 years in the computer science field. So to be a little bit fundamental here, at the end of the day, technology and computer science in particular is a stack, right? And it's all about adding abstraction layers on the tech stack that make technology easier to use, easier to adopt, and faster to build on. And it started, with, you start at the motherboard level with, assembly language, and then each programming language or library encapsulates some features that make them easier to use. And so one of the biggest example for that, which is not about programming, but more about using computers, is the revolution that happened when Microsoft released Windows on top of MS-DOS, and when Apple released Macintosh, because suddenly you went from a world where using a computer was done through a command line, which only was for a few tens of thousands of people in the world in labs, to becoming something where, as Bill Gates was putting it, let's have one computer into each desk at home and each desk in each office in the world, because suddenly anyone was able to use a mouse and double click on things to start doing things. And what we're trying to do here is exactly the same. We're just trying to add another layer on top of the technology stack to make it more accessible to use. And so I consider the top, before Bubble, it was really, React, CSS, jQuery, all those like web technologies, or like Ruby on Rails or Node on the server. We're just trying to add something on top of this to make it, again, give you a little bit less control. But our fundamental thesis is that this control is actually not necessary for 80 to 90% of the needs. And for the remaining 10%, you can still add that with code, but then it makes it way more easier to build on and and way more accessible. And in many ways, I think Bubble is actually much closer to React than React is to C or assembly language. And so the revolution that I'm pretending we're doing here, it is one, because it's going from like a text-based medium to a visual medium, but it's actually not that, conceptually, not that different from what people are already doing with modern web frameworks. And so this no-code movement that I'm talking about here, of visual programming, it's not like something cool in the news that you hear today. It's something that is doomed to happen because of market dynamics. At the end of the day, until we solve the shortage of engineers and the time it takes to build things that is just too slow, companies or computer scientists in academia will try to solve that problem, because there are tremendous value gains that can be made in terms of value created. And therefore, companies will keep iterating until this happens. I think Bubble is obviously one of the best ways to do this. I mean, I've been allocating 8 years of my life on this, but if it's not us, someone else will do it, because this is something that has to happen. That said, I'd love to take some questions.
All right. Thank you, Emmanuel. I'm just gonna take a chat here. So, okay, from Jesse. So first, how have you seen no-code applications perform in terms of security?
Great questions. So security is at two levels. There are, like more technical side, making sure that, hackers cannot penetrate our servers and everything. And then there is something else that is going to be app specific. So for what is at the infrastructure level, this is our responsibility. Similarly, to Amazon doing its work, its job, so that AWS is safe. So we do the same thing, and we do whatever we can from whatever we can to avoid, bad agents to get into our server and steal things. Where this starts becoming app specific is there are a lot of things that we can't know in advance for people. So let me give a particular example. When you build an application on something like Bubble, you need to decide yourself at some point which data should be able to be seen by which people. For instance, you might be building a review website where reviews can only be seen by your friends, and you might be building a review website like here where all reviews are public. We can't know that in advance, so what we build instead is just a user interface for you to define those rules and to say who can see what, that then we enforce on the servers when we make database calls. So then the question is really, how do we educate our users to make the right design choices when they build these things? And that's just an educational effort from us. It is true that the more accessible tools like this are, the easier it gets for people to make mistakes, because you have less training and people are less sensitive to security issues and stuff like this. And so it's our job to educate them, but it's definitely doable. Just take some time and good content and a lot of efforts with your users.
All right. So since other just getting more questions here. All right. Since other countries outside the US are moving to regulate software as an engineering field of practice, wouldn't this be like promoting companies to build bridges without civil engineers just because design patterns already exist for bridges?
So hold on, I'm actually going to read the question because I'm not sure. Well, that's it's a pushback we hear. I just don't think it's reasonable to think about it that way because of the shortage. We don't need that many bridges in the world. A lot of, most of the bridges have already been built, and so we can afford having some certifications to make sure that people build bridges properly. I think at the software level, given the need, a little mom and pop shop, a small business in the middle of nowhere needs better software to be more efficient. Otherwise, the market dynamics would just kill that business. Because if you think about it, over the last 20 years, the only productivity gains you're making as a business are software-based at the end of the day. And so we need way more people to build. Again, there is risk always enabling people to do more things, but there are also many software ways to ensure that things are safe. So back to my previous example with how accessible the data is that you need to decide as a builder. Well, when you publish your application for the first time to the web with a domain name, we actually state very clearly, these are the data that anyone can read. Now, you could argue that people are not forced to read this, but at some point, if an application starts getting some traction, and that's only when it matters, believe me, people will look into this seriously.
All right. So what are the current limitations of no code?
Well, if you in the bubble world, since people can add code, actually very, very little, because if something is missing, you can add code. If you try to use Bubble, I prefer talking about Bubble. Other tools, it's less my field, and Bubble tends to be is the tool that is the most flexible. So if you try to use Bubble entirely without code, not adding anything, the limitations are going to be twofold. From a visual standpoint, like user interface standpoint, what you're going to build with a no-code tool is usually not revolutionary visually. At the end of the day, it's going to be like Twitter or Airbnb, mostly going to be text, images, and inputs and buttons. If you try to build a platform game, no-code platforms are not going to be great at that. Turns out you have a lot of other software that are great to build games without code, but it's a very different world. So if you're trying to build a platform game that lives in the browser, this is even like something like Flappy Bird, for instance. It's not something that will work very well in Bubble. The other thing that, back to the example of the dating platform I was talking about, it's going to be tricky to build, to define, visually some, optimization algorithms, even like call it machine learning or like deep learning visually. That's just something that no code is not built for that. I don't think it will ever be. I actually know some teams, both in the startup world and in academia, that try to make, building these algorithms visual with some branching and tree view. I don't think this is going to work. But again, the goal of no code is not to replace software engineering for everything. The goal of no code, and Bubble in particular, is to make code not necessary for 80 to 90% of the use cases. And when something is missing, people can just add code.
All right. So another question here. So is no code only for front-end development, or can it create backends as well?
It depends on the tool, but with Bubble, you can definitely create backend. Bubble is a full stack replacement, so you can definitely create backend. When I mentioned, notrealtwitter.com as a Twitter clone, you can go there and try. You can tweet and share tweets and everything, and those things exist in the database. In our world, in the Bubble world, there is not such a thing as front-end and back-end. It's part of the abstraction effort that we're making, is that if you're building an Airbnb-type marketplace as a product owner, you don't really care where the data is, right? Is it on the back end or the front, whatever, right? You're just creating a marketplace where you have buyers and sellers sharing apartments and money. There's no technical concept here. And so we're trying to make those concepts irrelevant. But yes, you can definitely build back-end workflows.
Okay. So here's another question. How would an engineer leverage Bubble and the no-code philosophy?
Well, as I said, you can be much more efficient with no-code technologies. So use no-code what they're great for, and don't try to use them for what they're not great for. And you'll be able to build things probably 3-4 times faster. I'm saying not 6 times, as I was pointing out before, because I'm assuming an engineer will still write code for the missing parts. So you can basically have things to market much faster. And more importantly, if you partner with people that are product-minded but non-technical, finally you can tell them to build what they want to build themselves and not just be the person building for everyone, which is, I think, the dream for most software engineers.
Right. So got another question here. Do you see a future where machine learning and artificial intelligence will become more accessible to less experienced user through Bubble/no-code? If so, in what time frame?
So yes, I do, if those tools are packaged as an API. And they already are. So with Bubble, you can connect to any API. So for instance, if you want to leverage Google's image AI tools, they have some pretty cool ones. You can just use them that way. I'm not envisioning a world where people would start, training models themselves without code. Some people are trying to do this. I personally think this is starting to become starting to have diminishing returns, because even though the tools will be more accessible, the concepts that you need to understand as a user make that at this point, people will know how to code. And I think coding might still be the most efficient way, I would say, to build things. But and that's really core to the talk here, if engineers package these tools that are written with code in a way that the Bubble interface or any other no-code tool can consume, then suddenly the market is much bigger, because non-technical people can use it.
All right. So next question here is, where did you get the inspiration to create Bubble?
Mostly, as I was saying at the beginning, No, we were not trying to change programming. We're just trying to make sure that people who wanted to start companies could start companies. If you remember, back in 2012, this might be a long time ago for some people in the audience that are still in school, but it was, the beginning of the startup bubble. Facebook had just become a public company. And so a lot of people started thinking, wow, technology can actually be used. Airbnb started to become fairly well known at that point. People started thinking technology can now be used to improve the situation of a lot of work, like verticals or like jobs. And that was true for B2C and B2B tools. So for instance, B2C planning vacations and finding bed and breakfast becomes suddenly much easier through Airbnb because people forget that, but it was already something before. You could still get bed and breakfast at people's places. But people realize, wow, if you create an online platform, it's just easier to book and everything. And that would be true for, a lot of like industries that suddenly started having, platforms that would make the work more efficient. And there's just not enough engineers in the world to execute all those ideas. Turns out, the Airbnb founder was friends with an engineer, and so they started the company together. But had they not been friends, Airbnb might have never happened. And so we just felt it was a shame that people were not able to create things and felt that, okay, too many people want to build things. Those ideas are actually not radically new from a customer science standpoint. And these people are smart and driven. There has to be a way to make it easier for them. And that became Bubble.
Okay. So for an application built with Bubble, would the maintenance be taken care of by Bubble?
It depends which maintenance we're talking about. If we're talking about the infrastructure, like scanning servers, fixing bugs, because software development always has bugs in the code, that's on us. That's what you pay us for, basically. If it's about maintaining your application, building workflows, because either you made a mistake in your workflows, which can very much happen. And by the way, the Bubble, if you use Bubble in run mode, the person building the application has a debugger. We've created a higher level of abstraction on the debugger on top of the browser so that you can understand how your application behaves and why it behaves that way. But let's say you want to change those workflows or fix things, it's on you.
Okay. So when writing code in like Bubble, or no code, is it language specific, or can we use any language to add logic to it?
Currently, it's only using JavaScript, both on the client and the server. So on the server, if you want to write custom code, it runs in Node and AWS Lambda, and we package that as an action you can use in Bubble. We're a small team, and so far we're not able to support too many languages because we need to expose an API so that the code you write can actually interact with the application. So to be very clear, imagine you write some code that becomes an action. You want to be able in your code to refer to the previous action so that it makes sense to use it in a Bubble application. And so maintaining that API takes some work. And so far we've only worked on JavaScript. We're hoping on the server to add Python and R because they are supported by Lambda as soon as we can. On the client, it will always be JavaScript or some JavaScript-like languages because that's the language of the web.
All right, thank you. So unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So if you are part of the VIP Discord server, you can still ask Emmanuel questions on his channel. But right now we are gonna have our speed networking session coming up soon. So Emmanuel, thank you so much for the talk. It's been a pleasure and giving us a very interesting perspective of no code in the business perspective and also the developer's perspective.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
All right. So I'll see you guys in. Oh, sorry. Yeah. See you guys in the speed network session.